Ευλογητός ο Θεός ημών πάντοτε νύγκαια και στους αιώνας των αιώνων. Αμήν. Δόξα σε Χριστέ ο Θεός, επίσημον δόξα σε. Βασιλεύ ουράνιε παράκλητε, το πνεύμα της αλήθειας, ο πανταχού παρών και τα πάντα πληρών. Ο θησαυρός των αγαθών και ζωής χορηγός. Εθέ και σκήνωσον εν μήν και καθάρισον ημάς από πάσης κυλίδος και σώσον αγαθέ τας ψυχάς ημών.
Ουρανός πολύφωτος, η Εκκλησία ανεδείχθη άπαντας, φωταγωγούσα τους πιστούς, ενώ εστώτες κραυγάζομεν, τούτον των οίκων στερέωσον, Κύριε. Η Παρθένος σήμερον των προαιώνιων λόγων εν σπηλαίο έρχεται από τεκείνα απορρίτως, χόρευε οικουμένη, ακουτιστήσα, δόξασον μεταγγέλων και των ποιμένων, βουληθέντα εποφθήνε, παιδίων νέων των προαιώνων Θεών.
Good evening and welcome. Please be seated. Thank you once again for joining us this evening. As you know, this series is blessed by His Eminence Archbishop Makarios and under the guidance of His Grace Bishop Kyriakos of Sozopolis. And for those of you that have been, or this is your first time, the purpose of this particular series, Come and See, is to engage our faithful and people that are curious about the Orthodox faith in the beauty and the meaning of our worship and how it unites heaven and earth. It's designed to be in the form of discussions and dialogue with practical elements integrated throughout, which we will see in coming parts. The first part of this series is called Christian Worship Through the Ages and has been presented by the very Reverend Father Chris Dimolianis, the parish priest of Sts Raphael, Nicholas and Irene, who have hosted us for the last three particular sessions. The three talks that we've had, or the two talks we've had so far, are the early Christian church, who we are, from Christian empire to schism, what we have become, and tonight is the final part of this particular, or the final series of this particular part, more modern developments, what are we becoming? So without further ado, we'll introduce Father Chris. One housekeeping thing before I forget, if you haven't already, please make sure that you have signed the attendance sheet and make sure that you have registered. Those people that have attended all three of these particular seminars will receive a certificate via email. If you need it posted, you can respond and we will send it by post as well. So could we please all welcome Father Chris.
Thank you, Costa. Your Grace, Reverend Father, brothers and sisters in Christ, good to be here again. Now we're looking at some more modern developments in history. It's wonderful to think back in the early history of the Church and almost sort of reminisce in a very sentimental way of what the ancients went through. But now we're coming to more contemporary times. The last time we met, 2-3 weeks ago, whenever it was, we finished that session just about at the time of the schism, which resulted in what we call today the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. That's where we left off. So tonight we're going to continue our study of the history of the Christian Church, starting from the 15th century AD to the present. And as Costa said, we're going to be focusing on what are we becoming. And in order to look at this, we'll also be looking at the Orthodox Church around the world at present. And we're going to focus towards the end on the Orthodox Church in Australia, and in particular, the Greek Orthodox Church. So, after the schism in the mid-15th century, 1453, finally, last time I mentioned to you that there were some tribes from the east, the Ottomans, who were coming across towards Europe, and they tried for a long time to invade Constantinople. They finally succeeded in 1453, and from that time, the Ottoman Turk Muslim occupation took place in Constantinople, but not only Constantinople, they went further, and most Orthodox nations were actually occupied. And I'm sure most of you know that Greece was occupied for around about 400 years. And the amazing thing about this, I always think about this, you know, in the context of Orthodoxy in Australia. Okay, we've been here, for how long? 100 odd years, okay? For 400 years, our ancestors, those of Greek descendancy, our ancestors were occupied for 400 years, and there were a lot of things they were not allowed to do as Orthodox Christians. There was no education, there was no theological training of any kind. You weren't permitted to do the sign of the cross on the street. You couldn't even speak Greek in public, from what I understand. Church bells were forbidden. And there were a lot of things that happened that amaze me, that our forebears were able to keep their language, their culture, and their faith within 400 years. I find that truly amazing. It's a bit like what I said to you in the first session. Human nature is such that the more you tell people, no, you can't do this, the more they want to do it. And the more you'd say to people, you are free to do whatever you want to do, human nature being what it is, we think, we take it for granted and we don't worry about it as much as we might have. So this happened. It was a difficult time for 400 years for Greece and for other areas. You may know that the Ottomans were actually planning to move right across Europe into Western Europe. They were stopped at the door of Vienna, in fact, on the Danube. So those of you who have done a bit of history will recall that. So the mind boggles, and we ask the question, what would Western Europe have looked like if the Ottomans kept going and invaded Western Europe as well, and succeeded in invading Western Europe? That didn't happen, of course. So while this was happening and many Orthodox nations were occupied, Russia was not occupied, and they started to think about missionaries. And some of you may be surprised to hear that the Orthodox Church in China was established in the late 17th century. This is an icon of the Orthodox martyrs in China due to the period of the Boxer Rebellion. Think about this. Australia, as far as I know, only has one Orthodox saint that we know of, who is a Serbian Orthodox monk from Mount Athos, who is buried at the Serbian Orthodox monastery in Irene. And as far as I know, he's the only known Orthodox saint in Australia, buried in Australia. China has so many. That's interesting, isn't it? We have a lot more to go. We'll, God willing, have a lot more saints in Australia soon as time goes on. Now, in Alaska was originally owned by America, and it was sold to, the other way around, it was owned by Russia, I beg your pardon, and it was sold to America some centuries ago. And while it belonged to Russia, Saint Herman of Alaska, a Russian Orthodox monk and priest, went over to the native people on the islands in Alaska and around Alaska. These people were often in the past referred to as Eskimos. Today they're referred to as Aleutians or Inuit people. They're the native indigenous people of that region of Alaska. And St. Herman brought the Orthodox faith to them. So we need to understand, and most of us Greeks or people of Greek descent are a bit ignorant about things like this. Many of the native people today of Alaska are actually Orthodox Christians due to these missionaries that went there early in the history, in the 18th century. The Orthodox Church in Japan was established in 1871 AD by St. Nicholas Kasatkin. If you'd like to read about the ethos of Orthodox mission, he's a wonderful saint to read about what happened to him and when he went to China. I remember when I was studying at St. Andrew's Theological College, I had an opportunity to do an assignment on him, to write an essay on him, and I knew nothing of him before then, and I was fascinated by his life. He went over to Japan. He lived among the local Japanese people there as a Russian man. He learnt their language. He learnt their culture. He even learnt their religions, their various religions that they followed. And he just simply lived with them. And he was accepted by them to such a degree that when the war broke out between the Russians and the Japanese, he was one of the few Russians who were permitted to stay in Japan. He was that much loved by even the authorities, not only the local people. Anyway, after a while, St. Nicholas was approached by the local people, and they said, "What's this faith that you follow? Tell us about what this Orthodox faith is all about." So he started to teach the local people in their local Japanese language, and today the Japanese church is thriving, even today. And we see that the Cathedral of the Holy Resurrection was built in the late 1800s. This is the original cathedral. It was damaged sometime after that due to an earthquake, and it was rebuilt, but it's still there. You can visit it if you ever go to Tokyo and you look up the cathedral there. This is the first Japanese native bishop of Japan, Bishop Nicholas Ono of Japan, in 1941, because before him, that was, you can see by the date, that was obviously World War II. Before him, all the Japanese bishops of Japan were of Russian descent. But ever since from 1941, all bishops of Japan have been Japanese local native people. We move now to actually going back a bit, I suppose we need to say, the Protestant Reformation. It was very important to understand a little bit of this. This is a picture of Martin Luther, and he was a Roman Catholic, a very devout Roman Catholic Augustinian monk. And he was a brilliant biblical scholar in the local German university. He knew biblical Hebrew, biblical Greek, and biblical languages was his specialty. And obviously he knew the Bible fairly well. And as he was studying the Bible, he realized that things in his own Roman Catholic Church weren't right. So he started to protest. And in protesting, he was hoping that he might be able to reform the Roman Catholic Church. So I won't go into the details of what it was he was protesting about. If you want to look that up, feel free. But he was protesting about it in order to reform the Roman Catholic Church because he thought that they went off track, at least in comparison to the Bible. In the end, he didn't succeed, and he was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, and he wondered to himself, I'm paraphrasing the whole situation, of course, and keeping it simple, but he was wondering to himself, what do I do now? I've been kicked out of the Roman Catholic Church. I've been an Augustinian monk all this time. What do I do? Oh, I know. I'll start my own church. So he began what's today referred to as the Lutheran Church. So it started from him. Hence, this period of history is referred to as the Protestant Reformation. People protested. The original Protestant reformers were of Roman Catholic background, and eventually, as things went on, there were people who just simply broke away from each other, and they formed, as we'll see shortly, today, thousands of different groups. And they all broke away from one another, and this was a result of what we refer today as that Protestant Reformation. King Henry VIII, he was actually, he gets a bit of bad press because two things. He was a very devout Roman Catholic, extremely devout Roman Catholic. And secondly, he did not want to break away from Rome. And a lot of people simply say, well, he just wanted another wife, so he just decapitated one and got another one. You know, it wasn't as simple as that. What he was concerned about was he needed a male heir to the throne of England, because he knew if he died without a male heir to the throne, it would fall into civil war. And he needed to keep stability in England. He knew that was very important. And that's what resulted in having eventually 6 wives. And naturally the Pope forbade him from divorcing and marrying another one all the time. So eventually, because he had fallen out with the Pope, he decided to start the Church of England in 1529. So that broke away from Rome and was established in 1529. Now, when the Church of England moved to places like Australia and America, say in the time of the convicts, when it moved to Australia, it was originally referred to as the Church of England, but eventually in Australia, it became known as the Anglican Church in Australia. So when you hear of the Anglican Church, it's actually the Church of England in Australia. In America, it was given another name, the Episcopalian Church of the USA. Remember when Harry and Meghan were married some time ago, or I should say, sorry, Prince Harry and what's she referred to? What's her title now? Duchess, thank you. Well, when they were married, there was a bishop from America that came and gave the sermon. Do you remember him? He is, because people were thinking, who is this character? Where did he come from? Well, here's one of the Episcopalian bishops of America who was invited across, and he was there at the marriage. And in other words, he is a member of the Church of England of America, if that makes any sense. So that was the Church of England. There's a lot more to tell you about this, but I'll leave it at just that and move on. While all this was happening in the 19th century, remember last time we spoke about the schism and the tensions that were growing and the churches of the East and the West, which resulted in what we call the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches, just moved further and further apart. Well, in the 19th century, there were more developments that actually drove us even further apart. One of them, in 1854, was the dogma of Immaculate Conception, and it's not what most of you assume it is. It's got nothing to do with the virgin birth of Christ from Panagia. It's referring to the state of the Virgin Mary. And this dogma, and remember, in the Roman Catholic Church, when you declare something to be a dogma, it means if you don't accept this, you're no longer Roman Catholic. You must accept this as a Roman Catholic faithful. And the Immaculate Conception is about the Virgin Mary being born without what we would call the consequences of the ancestral sin of Adam and Eve. Okay? We believe that every single person who has come into this world is born with the consequences as a result of the ancestral sin of Adam and Eve, right? Now, there's a bit of interesting aspect to this. Sometimes you may have heard the term the original sin. In the Orthodox Church, although it's not really wrong to use that term, we tend not to use that term so much. We tend to call it the ancestral sin. And in the Orthodox theology, you and I are not responsible for their sin. That's their sin. We suffer the consequences of their sin. And you might be thinking, why am I telling you this? Because there's a difference in theology between East and West on this matter. So much so that I remember when we were studying at St. Andrews, Deacon John Chrysavier, who was our lecturer in church history and also patristics, he said that at the time that Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, was writing his treatise on the original sin in the Western Church, at the same time St. John Chrysostom was also writing a treatise on the ancestral sin of Adam and Eve. St. Augustine was writing it in Latin, St. John Chrysostom was writing it in Greek, and neither had read each other's writings on this topic, and they were poles apart. Poles apart. In the Western theology, if I can just summarize and say, you and I, according to that theology, are also responsible for Adam and Eve's sin. We are suffering the consequences of their sin, not just simply because of our personal sin, but we are responsible as being a human being for their sin as well. And we're suffering those consequences. In the Orthodox theology, we're not seeing it that way. We're not responsible. We suffer the consequences of those sins, which include our tendency to sin, death, and losing the intimacy with God as a consequence of all this thing, and the tendency of sin is an important one, because we always wonder, why is it that it's so easy to do the wrong thing and so much harder to do the right thing? Well, St. Paul would tell us that's because of this consequence that we suffer from as a result of the ancestral sin of Adam and Eve. So this dogma of Immaculate Conception then is saying, according to the Roman Catholic theology of this dogma, that the Virgin Mary was born without those consequences of the ancestral sin of Adam and Eve. Now, in the Orthodox Church, we do not believe that. We reject that, although we do believe and accept that she is sinless by grace, but not that she avoided the consequences of the ancestral sin. And this would have repercussions in the 20th century, because in 1950, the Roman Catholic Church declared the dogma of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. Now, a lot of people who are Orthodox assume, that's exactly like what we believe in the Dormition of the Holy Theotokos. Well, it's not, because in the Dormition, even that word says it, the Dormition means the falling asleep of the Virgin Mary, right? So we accept and believe that just like Christ died, physically died, and then rose from the dead, and then ascended bodily as well as spiritually, our belief in the Dormition is along those lines too. That's why, if you look at the theme of the Dormition of the Orthodox Church, we seem to be celebrating the theme of Pascha, death and resurrection and new life. So for us, all the things that happened to Christ in essence have happened to Panagia. In other words, she's the one that has followed in the steps of Christ after his resurrection and has experienced the very things that you and I are looking forward to experiencing through our death, resurrection, and eventual ascension, if we can say, to heaven, and our reuniting with our body and soul eventually. So there's a difference between, and whereas in the Roman Catholic tradition, most people in the Roman, not all, but most people in the Roman Catholic tradition believe that she did not die physically, but she was assumed to heaven, bodily and soul. See the difference of that? That's of great significance. And that door for that dogma in 1950 was opened up by this dogma that was released in 1854. Now, this separated us a bit more than after the schism. The next dogma that was proclaimed in 1870 in the First Vatican Council was the dogma of papal infallibility. That sent us much further apart. And what this dogma basically proclaims is that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, in his position as Pope, it's referred to technically in Latin ex cathedra, when he declares a teaching of the Church, of the Roman Catholic Church, he is considered to be infallible. Simply put, he can't make a mistake. In the Orthodox Church, we would never say that any individual is infallible, no matter how holy, no matter how great. We would say the Church is infallible. As the body of Christ, led by the Holy Spirit, the Church is infallible, but not one single member, even the saints, are infallible. So this drove us even further apart. Now, sometime after this, Pope Leo XIII, in 1894, wrote an encyclical, a letter, and he wrote it and sent it to the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. It's referred to as the Preclara Gratulationis. Sounds like a Greek name, doesn't it? But basically, it was sent to the Eastern Church, and if I can summarize it in a phrase, it basically was saying to the people of the East, hey, why don't you come and reunite with us? And what they meant by that is, why don't you accept the Pope as your head bishop and accept our doctrines now and what we do and what we believe? Okay? Well, Ecumenical Patriarch Anthimus VII in 1895, they held a synod, a council in Constantinople to discuss this encyclical from the Pope. And this patriarch described in what he wrote back on behalf of the synod, basically said, listen, these two dogmas that you've just recently pronounced for us are simply Roman novelties. That's the words he used to describe these two doctrines. So he answered the encyclical of the Pope and said to him, look, thank you for your invitation, but why don't you return to the faith of the early centuries? Thank you for inviting us to come and join with you. But we'd be happy if you simply return to the faith that we had in common. Remember in the first session we covered, and we looked at where the schism occurred in the second session, that in the first period of history, the church was undivided, was visibly one. And what the patriarch was saying then is, why don't you return to that faith that you had, rather than keep adding new dogmas which veer away from the teaching of Christ and the apostles, why don't you come back to the faith of our unity that we used to hold together once upon a time? So it was an interesting sort of beginning of some sort of dialogue that happened there. This timeline beautifully explains what I'm trying to say. Notice at the bottom of the red there, the first roughly 1,000 years, it was the undivided church. The church was basically visibly united. And the blue arrow at the top shows as time goes on, there's a deviation from the original doctrine of the undivided church. So what we would say in using the term or the adjective orthodox, and I mentioned this to you in the first session that we met, by calling ourselves Orthodox, all we're saying is not that we're better than all of you. What we're saying is we have simply stuck to what we were believing in our faith in the first millennium, and we've simply continued on that same line, believing the stuff that was given to us in the first millennium. Unfortunately, and this is our statement to the others, you have deviated from the truth that we held together once upon a time. So, in looking at this, we could say in a simple fashion, because sometimes, when you see thousands of groups across the world calling themselves Christian, who are they all? We could boil it down to three different groups. Anyone calling themselves Christian today, what they're trying to say is either I'm an Orthodox Christian, or I'm a Roman Catholic, or I'm a Protestant. Because Protestantism covers, it's like an umbrella term that covers all those other groups that aren't Orthodox or Roman Catholic. So that's the reality of where we've ended up today. A shameful reality, sadly, but when Ecumenical Patriarch Anthimus VII said to the Pope, the 13th, come back to this, come back to the faith we held together, I remembered when reading that in our studies of theology, I remember with Archbishop Stylianos, I remember asking this question. So, Your Eminence, are you saying then that all these others need to become Orthodox? And his answer was yes and no. And he said, let them stay where they are, but let them return to the faith that we had together. In other words, they need to become Orthodox in faith and ethos. What he meant by that was, and you need to understand, because some people get confused about this, what he's saying in effect is, look, just because you do your cross a little bit different to how I do it, just because you do your liturgy a little bit different to how we do it, that's not what divides us. The things that divide us are things of faith, the essential elements of our faith. So if we return to that together, there's a hope of reunity. If we don't return to that, and there's no way we're going to compromise our faith, so don't expect it, it will never happen. It will never happen. All right, now, from 1821, you probably heard that there's freedom from the Turkish yoke, and then other places took longer than those years. And then we have various 20th century developments as well after that freedom. Now, as I've mentioned in past weeks, or last time at least, that the missions of the church, even though Russia was free to go into missionary journeys around the world at that time, as we saw earlier, Well, the rest of the church then that was previously occupied was now free too, and we can see some missions happening across the world, especially now under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But migration was the key one, so much so that, as we've mentioned before, places like Australia and America, for example, and other places as well, have had orthodoxy come in through migration. If it wasn't for migration, Australia wouldn't have as much Orthodox churches established here. The other thing that happened in the 20th century, a controversial development, was the ecumenical movement. And a lot of people are very polarized about this. In essence, what is the ecumenical movement? It's basically all these thousands of groups around the world calling themselves Christians, saying that we follow Christ, saying to each other, hey, yes, we have our differences, but we have our similarities. Why don't we at least start talking to one another? Let's start having a dialogue. Okay, as to where it leads us, we won't worry about that for now. Let's just have a dialogue. Let's just start talking again. And I always have this image of siblings that have had a falling out. They refuse to speak to one another. Well, at least let's come together and start talking again. It may be tense, it may be awkward, but at least let's start sharing and talking with one another. In essence, that's all the ecumenical movement is. And I don't know if Your Grace or others people in this room have had much involvement in meeting up in ecumenical dialogue and ecumenical movement. I've had a little bit of experience with it. And can I say, never once did I feel that we as an Orthodox Church are trying to compromise our faith. And I say that because that's one of the criticisms that some people have of ecumenical dialogue and the ecumenical movement, that we are somehow going to compromise who we are as Orthodox Christians in order to attain a false or pretense unity, which is not what the ecumenical movement is, especially not for us. Okay, now this is one development. Remember I spoke about the schism, that there was an event where the Pope of the day and the Patriarch of the day excommunicated one another, and I emphasise to you that it wasn't the churches that divided necessarily at that point, it was the individual hierarchs that excommunicated one another. Well, in 1965, in Jerusalem, the then Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I met up with the then Pope Paul VI as a means of moving together and symbolically lifting the excommunications of their forebears. Some people go and have said, I've actually heard people say it to me, they're trying to reunite the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Church. Well, it's a step of simply coming together in dialogue. That's what they were doing there. They come to say, look, our forebears excommunicated one another. Why don't we, as individuals, as hierarchs of our churches, lift these excommunications from one another and let's just begin a dialogue. And we've been very blessed in Australia because when this dialogue commenced, one of the chief pioneers was our own Archbishop Stylianos of Australia. He was chosen by the Ecumenical Patriarch to be the co-chair of the international dialogue with the Vatican on behalf of the Orthodox. And we had a wonderful opportunity to have in his lectures him telling us up-to-date contemporary developments of the dialogue between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics. And he was telling us how difficult it was. He was telling us how often things would move well, because when you get together with people, you get to know each other, you get to respect one another, you get to know that the other person pains over what's going on as well. So when you meet the other, it's a different thing than just being distant and saying, well, I'm here and you're there, leave me alone. But once you come together, you realise, hang on, we have more in common than what we originally thought. So this was a very symbolic, powerful gesture. At this meeting, or for this meeting rather, they commissioned an icon, the Meeting of the Brothers. And those of you who are aware, the patron saint of Rome is St. Peter the Apostle, and the patron saint of Constantinople is St. Andrew the Apostle, who was considered to be the founder of the church in Byzantium, which is the ancient city of Constantinople. You also may know, if you know the scriptures well, that Peter and Andrew were biological brothers. So the fact that the head of Rome and the head of Constantinople met at this historic moment was considered to be the meeting of the brothers. You know, the brothers who had falling out, and now they're coming together and commencing a dialogue. Not everything was rosy, however, and everything didn't proceed that well. And even now, there's a big struggle in this dialogue. And His Eminence Archbishop Makarios used to tell us of the difficulties of the dialogue and how things weren't moving that well from time to time. The biggest factor back then, and the biggest factor even today, is this. This is a photo of the funeral of Pope John Paul II. And as you can see, on the left in the middle, there seems to be what appears to be an Orthodox deacon in the funeral of Pope John Paul II. On the right-hand side, you see what appears to be an Orthodox bishop. And just under him, you see what appears to be Orthodox clergy. And when this funeral was taking place and they showed it on TV, I had a lot of people from our church say to me, how was it that the Orthodox clergy were doing the funeral of Pope John Paul II? And the answer is they are not Orthodox clergy. They are Roman Catholic clergy who belong to what we call the Uniate churches. You may have heard them as the Eastern Catholics, the Byzantine Catholics, the Ukrainian Orthodox, or not Ukrainian Catholics, various groups that are referred to as Eastern Rite Roman Catholics. We refer to them as the Uniates. And what happened here when this was going on, not the funeral, but the dialogue, and there was tension developing over this during the dialogue because the Orthodox in the dialogue were saying, well, these people are a deception because our people are seeing them and they're assuming that already we've reunited. And people are deceived by this. But the Roman Catholics, in their defense, were saying, no, they're a point of bringing us together because they share something of both of us. And they actually try to, through these uniates, we're going to be united. But we see it as a deception, and our people are deceived by this. By the way, if you ever walk into one of their churches, you'd swear you're in an Orthodox church. By that I mean it looks Orthodox, the service is exactly the same way we do it, except that they don't commemorate an Orthodox bishop. They would commemorate the Pope as their first bishop. Where these people came from, by the way, most of them came from Eastern European countries. And some centuries ago, some Latin missionaries from the Vatican were sent to them with a proposal on behalf of the Pope. It was basically said to them, look, the Pope has a deal for you. If you accept him as your head bishop and come under the Roman Catholic fold, you can keep everything that you do the same. You can have your married clergy. Okay, some people say, oh, Roman Catholics can't get married, priests that is. Well, it's not true. There's a precedent in several circumstances where they do have married clergy, and this is one of them. They allow the uniate clergy to marry, at least the priests and the deacons. And you can do everything like you already do as far as the Orthodox are concerned, except that you now have as your head bishop the Bishop of Rome. So the dialogue has had tension with this, and the Orthodox still find it unacceptable, and we don't see it as a point of reunity or helping us reunite. So I don't know how it's going to proceed, but that's the main sticking point. Okay, what we're going to do now is go for a quick overview of the whole church across the world and just show you where everyone is and under which jurisdiction they come under. Starting first with the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, obviously that being situated in the ancient city of Constantinople in modern-day Turkey, looks after all that region there that used to be referred to as Asia Minor, but now referred to as Turkey. But there are various archdioceses that come under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and when you hear the term archdiocese as opposed to a metropolis, the basic difference is the size of the church, as in the number of people, I mean. So an archdiocese is a much larger church, people-wise, than a metropolis. A metropolis is a smaller church, and the head bishop of an archdiocese is an archbishop, and the head bishop of a metropolis is a metropolitan bishop. That's basically how it works. And in some key centres, as we'll see, the head bishop is referred to as a patriarch. So obviously the patriarch of Constantinople, and who looks after all the things I'm going to show you now, is the ecumenical patriarch of these regions. As I mentioned to you also in the past, he is referred to today among the Orthodox as the first among equals of all the bishops. He's a bishop, but he's the first among equals. He has a position of honour. So the first archdiocese to mention to you is the Archdiocese of Crete. It's not under the Church of Greece. It's directly under the Ecumenical Patriarchate as an archdiocese. Then we have North and South America, which is also an archdiocese under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Australia is not under the Church of Greece, as a lot of people assume. It's actually directly under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And in case you're wondering, why is this? The canons of the Church specifically and clearly state that when a church is established for the first time outside of a traditional Orthodox nation, that church by canon law automatically comes under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. That's what the canons say about establishment of new churches. That's why America, Australia and other churches are under Constantinople and not under the Church of Greece directly. Okay, so Australia, Great Britain is an archdiocese as well under the Patriarchate. We have various metropolises now, obviously smaller churches, which includes the Dodecanese Islands, you know, Rhodes and those islands over there, as well as some provinces in the northern part of Greece that are metropolises under Constantinople. In Europe, there are various nations that have the Orthodox Church as metropolises. In Europe, there's France, Germany, Austria, Sweden and all of Scandinavia. They're metropolises under Constantinople. The Church of Belgium, we've had the current Metropolitan of Belgium, Athenagoras, visit us here in Australia several times, and he's done a couple of services at South Melbourne when I was there. It was a wonderful man. He's actually a native Belgian. You may know that the native language of the Belgians is Flemish, but he's fluent in Greek, fluent in English, fluent in French and Flemish as well. When he was telling me that, I said, Flemish, what's that? I thought that's when you're clearing your throat or something, you know. He said, no, it's a language. Apparently it's connected to Dutch or something. But he's a beautiful man. If you ever meet him, when he came and did the service, I said to him, he was a bishop at that time, I said, Your Grace, let's go and have some lunch if you're available. Is there anything particular that you really like to have in Australia? And as a Belgian, he said, I want to taste Australian beer. He said, I want to taste Australia. So we bought him a Crown Lager and he liked it. So, but a good man, very good man. Now, Switzerland is a metropolis of Constantinople. Italy and Malta, we had the current Metropolitan Bishop visit us a few years ago in Melbourne as well. Father Kyriakos, you may remember, he was then a Metropolitan of Spain at the time, and he did a service in our church. You remember that? Yeah. Spain and Portugal, that's where he was before. Now, we come to other metropolises outside of Europe, which includes New Zealand, which looks after some of the Pacific Islands, Fiji, they have a mission there, as well as Western Samoa and some other places in the Pacific. Hong Kong and Southeast Asia metropolis looks after China, India, the Philippines. Actually, the story of the Philippines is an interesting one. I remember when we were at the Theological College, Deacon John Chrysavier, who was the sub-dean of the college at the time, told us a bit of the history there. There was a Roman Catholic priest, Filipino Roman Catholic priest, who had started to study some history of the church and look into it. And the more he looked at it, he was attracted by the Orthodox Church. And he wrote a letter to our Archbishop in Australia, and he wanted to know more about Orthodoxy. So he corresponded with Deacon John Chrysavier, and eventually he wanted to become Orthodox himself as a Roman Catholic priest. So he was connected with the Patriarchate, and arrangements were made for him and his whole congregation to become an Orthodox church, and for him to be an Orthodox priest in the Philippines. So he does wonderful, he's probably passed away by now, but he does wonderful missionary work there. Indonesia, that we had a student at our theological college who was a member of the Orthodox Church of Indonesia, Gregory. Some of you may have met him. He came across and studied with us. Malaysia and Singapore. Korea is a separate metropolis with their own metropolitan bishop. Mount Athos comes under Constantinople. A lot of people aren't aware of that. Some people assume that it's autonomous or comes under the Church of Greece, but it's actually under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The Church of Iran is also under Constantinople. Now we come to the next of the ancient patriarchates, Alexandria, which looks after Egypt and all of Africa. And we know our good friend, His Grace Bishop Themistocles, who visits us here every year, who was here recently, is part of this patriarchate in Alexandria. And the wonderful thing in the last 50 years, particularly the last 100 years, but particularly in the last 50 years, there's been amazing missionary work done in all of Africa, in most of Africa, I should say. But Africa and the Patriarchate of Alexandria is one of the ancient patriarchates. It was actually started by Saint Mark the Apostle, who started the church there and took the church there. And then we have the Patriarchate of Antioch, which looks after Syria and Lebanon, and also the Church of Iraq is under their jurisdiction. There are a lot of Antiochian Orthodox people in Australia. Many Lebanese people or Syrian people who are Orthodox Christians belong to this Patriarchate of Antioch. We have now the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which basically just looks after Israel and Jordan. Now we have some more newer patriarchates that were established, and one thing we need to understand, these newer patriarchates are given this blessing from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And I say that with all this stuff that's happening now with Ukraine, it seems like in Russia they've forgotten that they would not be a patriarchate if it wasn't the Ecumenical Patriarchate giving them that blessing. So the Patriarchate of Moscow looks after basically Russia. There's the Patriarchate of Serbia. These are more modern patriarchates, and they were established as patriarchates due to historical circumstances. Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, very tiny there, you can barely see it at the back, you probably can't. Georgia apparently is the oldest Christian nation in the world, the first nation ever to declare itself as Christian, Georgia. Now we have autocephalous churches. All that means is that they're self-governing. They have their own synod, they have their own council of bishops, and Cyprus is one of those. And also Greece is an autocephalous church. Poland is autocephalous, and Albania is also autocephalous with their own council and synod. The Czech Republic and Slovakia is also in that state, it's autocephalous. Now we come to autonomous churches, which means they have a certain amount of self-governance, but they come under a mother church. And we have, in this case, the Church of Finland and the Church of Estonia, who are directly under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, but they have a sense of self-governance to some degree, but they're under the mother church of Constantinople. Now, this diagram, I'm not going to go through all the detail of it, it's very detailed, but the beauty of this little diagram is it reminds us that all churches that are canonical, in other words, valid Orthodox churches, are all connected to Constantinople. And they're all considered as autocephalous churches, all those ones that are in the black there. And we see all the other ones that branch off from them, but they're all connected. So in that case, what we can say, this diagram reminds us that anyone who's outside of this connection to Constantinople is not a valid Orthodox church. They might think they are, they might call themselves. Can I go and really go on a limb here and say, if I today, God forbid, say I'm leaving the church and I'm going to go down the road and set up a hall and call myself, I don't know, whatever, the Australian Orthodox Church. The moment I decide to do that, I am no longer an Orthodox priest, and even though I think I'm running an Orthodox church, it's not. So everything I do becomes invalid. All the baptisms, and can I say that if I did, God forbid, decide to do this, You know what that means? It means that your priesthood is more valid than mine from that moment on. What does that mean? It means that if I was a schismatic, non-canonical priest, okay, and we walked out of this building tonight and we came across a tragic crash and the person who's about to die said, I've never been baptized, can you baptize me? Do you know that if one of you baptize him, not your grace or Father Kyriakos, not, but one of the lay people, if you baptize that person at that point, they are validly baptized. But if I'm schismatic and I did it, that person is not baptized. That's what we're talking about. See, a lot of people don't think you hear people say, oh, it's only politics. It's not politics, it's ecclesiology. It's the church. And you're either connected to the body of Christ or you're not. There's no grey area in this. You're either in or you're not. So I want to emphasize that point to you. If you're not in this connection of the family of Orthodox churches, you are not a canonical, valid Orthodox priest or church or whatever. Okay, now we move on to the Orthodox Church in Australia. The first Orthodox Divine Liturgy in Australia was in 1820. It was on Kirribilli Point, which is a great honour because that's where one of the residences of the Prime Minister is. So it's a great honour to know that the first Orthodox Divine Liturgy was celebrated there. It was by a Russian Orthodox priest who was obviously part of this Russian Antarctic expedition that pulled into Sydney Harbour in 1820. And he must have had vestments and vessels and everything else like that. They got off the ship onto Kirribilli Point and they held an open Divine Liturgy on Australian soil for the very first time. In the 1820s, specifically 1829, the first Greeks arrived. For me, it's no surprise that they were convicts, a group of about 9 sailors who were charged by Britain as being pirates. They were charged with piracy, okay, the first Greeks that came. 2 of the 9 that came here as convicts, all the rest went back to to Greece, wherever, but 2 stayed and they lived out their lives here in Australia. In May 1898, the first Orthodox Church, Holy Trinity, was built in Sydney. In my last year of study, I was ordained in my last year of study, and before I went to my first post up in Cairns, I was asked to look after this church for the 2 months or so before I finished my studies and moved on. So for me personally, it was a great honour to be asked to serve the oldest Orthodox church ever established in Australia. Now, until 1902, priests, service books and sacred vessels came from Jerusalem. They were helping out. Obviously, people here contacted Jerusalem and said, look, we need help here. There wouldn't have been many Greek Orthodox people at the time, but they needed help and they received that help from Jerusalem. Then in 1903, the Church of Greece stood up and basically offered assistance. And because people were starting to come, early migration from some of the places of, people who have been here 4 or 5 generations. You may know, some Castellarisians, the people from Ithaki and Kifira and all those places that were coming out at that time. Now, from 1908, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, remember I said to you before that the canon state that any church established outside of an Orthodox nation needs to come automatically comes under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Well, at this time, the Ecumenical Patriarchate acknowledged that Australia really should be under their jurisdiction. But it wasn't until 1924 that the Ecumenical Patriarchate actually established what was then called the metropolis of Australia and New Zealand. Metropolis because it was a rather small church at that time. And notice Australia and New Zealand. 1924 is a very important date. We're heading towards the 100-year celebration of the establishment of our church here under the Patriarchate in 2 years' time. And do you know, and I'll tell you at the end a little bit more, preparations are being made for this 100-year celebration already from now. So we're going to be celebrating this event in a big way in Australia. Now, the first bishop arrives, a metropolitan bishop, because it's a metropolis, and it was Metropolitan Christophoros Chnitis. I've read a bit about him, and I really felt sorry for him. He really suffered here. And when I realised that, what else I realised? every single archbishop Australia has had has suffered, and suffered greatly. This man, if you read what they did, by the way, anyone go on to Trove? Anyone found that website called Trove? It's fantastic. You can actually search digital scannings of old newspapers of Australia. And I actually found many articles on him, and they trumped up the Greeks of the day. Many of them were against him, and they trumped up a lot of false charges of immoral behaviour. Took him to court. He won the case because it was proved that they were bringing in false witnesses, and they got all these sailors to give false witness and all this sort of stuff. But he really suffered, the poor man. That's why he's only here for 5 years. He had to finally go. I mean, he wasn't achieving anything. No one would listen to him because they all had heard all this gossip that people had manufactured. So he really, really suffered. And can I tell you, the same thing is happening today. We haven't changed, have we? Human nature is like that. I don't know why, but that's how we're like. Is it just the Greeks or just everyone? I don't know. So he came here as the first Metropolitan Bishop, and he left after 5 years. Now, when he came, there was some local opposition, which resulted in what we know as a few independent communities. One of the worst areas of Australia who suffered under this condition was in Adelaide. And at present, as far as I understand, there's about 5 schismatic churches still there. Is it 5, Your Grace? I think it's something like that. So it's a sad affair, and what it's all about is basically the people of the day got so used to not having anyone basically leading them that they got upset that someone had come and tried to lead them, basically. They thought, we were fine without you, thank you very much. Now that you've come into the picture. So as a consequence, what I was saying to you before, because they stayed as independent communities, they're not part of this family called the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that means that their so-called clergy are not clergy. You are more of a priest. All of you, even the women, are more of a priest than these characters are. So look at the scandal that's happened here in Australia. Thankfully, and I thank God, that the last years of Archbishop Stylianos' life, and from the moment Archbishop Makarios has arrived, a lot of this has been healed. So this is a good move for all of us here. And I really pray to God that all this is healed very soon too, so we can just get on with it. Okay, we move on. In 1927, there's more than 10,000 Greeks in Australia. So as you can see, not a very large church really. In 1954, and this is the dawn of the migration, 1954, because just after that is when they all started coming in numbers, there's about 75,000. In 1959, the church here grew to such a degree through migration that the metropolis is now elevated to what was then called the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of Australia and New Zealand. The Metropolitan now becomes an archbishop, and a new archbishop is sent. An archbishop comes for the very first time. So the first archbishop, before they were Metropolitan bishops, the first archbishop that comes is Archbishop Ezekiel Tsoukalas, who came in 1959. He stayed here for quite a while, till 1975. He was amazing. He did some amazing good work. He set the foundations to lead the way for the establishment of a theological college. He built and consecrated quite a few churches around Australia. He travelled around Australia. I remember, God rest his soul, Father Basil Christofis, who was a parish priest of this church, was telling me that he was his personal secretary for many, many, many years. And he told me the story, beautiful story. Archbishop Ezekiel was a prolific letter writer. This is before computers, right? He was a prolific letter writer. He'd be writing letters all day, all night, a lot of letters. And Father Vasily was his secretary. And Father Basil recalls driving out in the country, out in the middle of nowhere, and the Archbishop said, stop, I've got to write a letter. And they stop out in the middle of nowhere, and Father Basil grabs his typewriter out of the car, and they set up a table, a fold-up table under a tree in the middle of the bush, and he starts dictating a letter to him, and he writes this letter. It was a beautiful story. George, is that typewriter still around? Ah, okay. That would be a historical thing, that typewriter. So, Archbishop Ezekiel, under his watch in 1963, there was a schism in Melbourne with the Central Kinotita in Lonsdale Street. And there was a schism that lasted from 1963 to 1970, which means all the sacraments and everything that was done at that time from 1963 to 1970 were all invalid. Thankfully, within his time here in 1970, so it happened on his watch, but he also healed it on his watch. So that was a wonderful blessing. In 1970 it was healed, and there was a thing stated, maybe some of you may recall, if your parents were married in one of these Kinotita churches at the time, that they weren't valid marriages. Anyone been? You may not be willing to admit it anyway, it's another story. Or people who were baptised there. And what the agreement was through the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and even now, if someone comes and we see that they've been baptised during that time in one of these churches, we would chrismate them. So if they were baptised in one of these churches back in 63 to 70, we would chrismate them to validate their baptism, or we'd read a prayer for the couple if they had been married in one of these churches as well. Can I say, this is my perception of this since being in Melbourne, Melbourne has never fully recovered since that schism here, and it still taints us here in Melbourne. What am I talking about? I'll give you just one simple example. Let's compare Melbourne and Sydney. You all know there are many, many more Greek Orthodox in Melbourne than there are in Sydney, right? Why has Sydney got 3 large Greek Orthodox colleges and Melbourne, which is much, much bigger, has only got 2? Why is that? I believe it's from this. It has tainted us here. I don't know, some of you may disagree with what I'm saying, but I feel that those times, and there were other events too, which has kept Melbourne back a little bit. Now, maybe it's the time to just move on and leave it all behind, and a lot of it has happened, but unfortunately that has affected us here. Okay, moving on. In 1961, there's about 160,000 Greeks in Australia, so the numbers are growing rapidly. In 1970, because the church is growing so large, for practical administrative reasons, the Ecumenical Patriarchate forms what is now still called the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of Australia. And that is the official title of our church in Australia. But when it states the church's name as that, it also creates what is now still referred to as the metropolis of New Zealand. So basically separated New Zealand from Australia for administrative jurisdictional reasons. Archbishop Stylianos, who is the longest serving archbishop here, and all who knew him well would know that he was a very strong leader. He suffered greatly too, as it seems anyone who's an archbishop is going to suffer. Well, Christ suffered too. I'm not trying to draw direct connections, but I'm just saying that when you lead a people, it's not an easy job. And he achieved so much. He finally established what the dream of Archbishop Ezekiel was, of establishing a theological college here. And Archbishop Stylianos was probably the right person to do it, simply because he started off as an academic. Those who knew him would know he was very much an academic, so much so that he never expected to actually become an archbishop. He used to tell us that he thought he'd be spending the rest of his life as a professor at the University of Thessaloniki or something, teaching theology. That's what he thought his life would be, and living his life as a monk, basically. But as it turned out, he was asked several times by the Patriarchate to be Archbishop of Australia. He knocked it back a couple of times, but eventually he accepted. Coming out here not knowing, he was never a priest in a parish. He told us himself. Okay, so he didn't know how to run a daily parish. And he was sent here as the Archbishop of Australia and said, okay, make it work. So he told us, you have to become an administrator. Bishops aren't meant to be administrators, but you have to become an administrator. You have to know what's happening. And that's the position that he had. Okay, in 1976, there's about 375,000 Greeks in Australia. And then in 1981, in the census, 421,281. I always wonder who that one is. Greek Orthodox in Australia. Now, I've got this because in my mind, this is one of the greatest accomplishments of our church in Australia. From this moment in 1986, when St Andrew's College is established, we no longer need to import clergy. There has been clergy coming from outside, but all the theological training is now done in-house in Australia. And there are many, probably several men and women in this very room who has studied at St Andrew's Theological College. So it's a wonderful blessing for us to be able to attain theological studies, and particularly for those who are training for the clergy as well, particularly for those. So this was a wonderful, bring back memories, Your Grace. Which room was yours? Yeah?
About the third in the centre.
The third.
From right to left.
This one here.
Yeah, that one or the one next to it?
That one.
On the left.
So one of these two. Actually, I can see you waving. Some beautiful times, I've got to say. His Grace and I have reflected on our time there. It was a wonderful blessing to be there. That's where we first met. And a wonderful opportunity for us in Australia. Like I said, it's really clearly in my mind one of the greatest achievements of our church here in Australia, that His Eminence Archbishop Stylianos, together with all the people who were instrumental, established this college. Because from now on, especially in the hands of Archbishop Makarios, this is just going to thrive, and it's going to help us so much here in Australia. Okay, our first Australian-born bishop is consecrated in 2011. And many of you know him personally because he was here at Oakley as a priest, and he was here as a bishop for years as well. Bishop Kyriakos of Militopoulos, the first Australian-born bishop. Every single bishop we've had before Bishop Kyriakos was all Greek-born or born overseas somewhere at least, mostly in Greece as far as I know. Now, as you all know, Archbishop Makarios of Australia is our current Archbishop, and already in the few years he's been here, he's done amazing things. And I'm speaking from the perspective of clergy who we've got to see him and work with him more than what you have, and he's just amazing. I've never met anyone quite like this man. And we are so blessed. I keep saying to people how blessed we are to have an archbishop like Archbishop Makarios. And again, notice what's happening. When someone's moving forward, people are trying to knock him down. I don't know what it is about us, but that's what's happening. He's done amazing things. Administratively, you should see what he's already started to do. And the most amazing thing that he's done, in my mind, is this. From only 2 or 3 bishops that we had in Australia, not 2, we had about 3 or something, we've got that many bishops now. And you know, out of those 8 bishops that are there with His Eminence, 6 of them are Australian-born. I'd like to include you too, Your Grace, but you're born in Paphos, so I can't. But you're an Aussie in heart, aren't you? Yeah. So 6.5 of our bishops are Australian-born. Yeah. And they're all fluent English speakers anyway. And now this was His Eminence's. It was what's the thing when you perceive, you can really the view, you can look ahead, visualize. Vision. That's it. Yep. The Archbishop's vision to do this, and you know, no one thought about this before, but it's been a great move, and it's going to make the ability to administer the Archdiocese even better, and already has started to be that way. And it can only get better from here on. That's why I can say, by the blessing and grace of God. Now, another thing that His Eminence innovated is this year, just a couple of months ago, we held we all held together, the first National Synaxis of Clergy in Australia. Now, this might sound like such a simple thing, but no one has ever called all the clergy together, only clergy. We have clergy laity congresses from time to time, but all the clergy of Australia together, we have them locally in Melbourne or, state get-togethers and things like that from time to time, but we've never done this on a national scale before. And it was a wonderful opportunity. And if I had to describe why we did this, well, there's 2 basic reasons. One is just to get together. with all the clergy across Australia. Just that was significant. But the second and the most important thing was this. We came to learn how to become better priests. That's basically the crux of why he called us all together. Let's get together and let's learn how to become better priests. And you might be thinking, how to do the Thimiato better, or how to bless better than not. No, that's not what His Eminence is about. And I had a chance to just have a brief conversation with him during the synaxis, and I was talking to him about what I would have thought would be a good idea. And he said to me, he looked at me, I liked the way he looked at me, and he said to me, Father, the way you bless people, even if you do it wrong, is not going to make you a better or a worse priest. The thing that's going to make you a better priest is two things, humility and love. And that's, if I had to recite, what did I learn at the synaxis? That's what I learned. To have humility and love, I am becoming a better priest. And all of us got to hear that message at that synaxis, and hopefully took it all on board as well. It was a wonderful opportunity to share, to listen to a very experienced clergy on various aspects of ministry. And the most amazing moment was when we all liturgized together. That was awesome. And think about it, while you were sleeping, we were all praying for you. We were all praying for you together. We were combined in prayer for everyone in Australia. It was a powerful liturgy. And everyone I spoke to, all the clergy I've spoken to who attended this, sensed this peace. The liturgy was just beautiful. It was just so peaceful. And with so many clergy, I thought it's going to be disorganized, get a bunch of Greeks together, it's chaos. But it wasn't. It was just so smooth, wasn't it, Your Grace? It was just a beautiful liturgy, and it just flowed smoothly. There was no sort of hiccups or any issues like that. It was just a blessed liturgy. It was beautiful. We're all uplifted that day, all together. Now, this is where I end for tonight. As I mentioned earlier, in 2024, we are celebrating our 100 years of the Church here in Australia under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It's going to be a big celebration. I don't know everything that's being planned. I've just had a few glimpses and a few ideas that have been mentioned. But it's going to be a great celebration that we're all going to be part of, and we're all going to be invited to be part of as well. So look out for that. And this is where I end tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to the 3 parts that I put to these sessions. And with this opportunity, before we go to questions, I'd just like to thank the people who have assisted in putting this on.